So picture this. It's 1258 BCE, and after decades of just brutal, world-shaking warfare, the two greatest military superpowers on Earth did something that was just entirely unprecedented.
Right, yeah, they had been grinding each other to dust over control of the ancient Near East.
Yeah, just bleeding their treasuries dry, sending tens of thousands of men to die.
And then instead of fighting to the bitter end, they just stopped.
Exactly. They sat down, they drafted this massive, highly specific legal document, and they essentially invented international law.
Which is just a profound shift in how we understand human progress,
It really is. And to you, the listener joining us right now, welcome to a highly customized deep dive.
Yeah.
Because today we are looking at the people who poured the concrete of civilization.
We usually get so drawn to the wrecking balls of history, right?
Right. The conquerors, the dramatic collapses.
The massive armies sweeping across a map. We rarely spend time on the ancient engineers. The people who looked at a chaotic, fragmented world and basically asked, how do we build a framework that can survive a Tuesday, let alone a century?
I love that. And we have a genuinely fascinating set of personal notes from you to unpack today. You've provided us with this source that blends the ancient history of the Hittite Empire.
This late Bronze Age superpower in modern-day Turkey or Anatolia.
Right. It blends that history with this really deep psychological framework. Specifically, your notes analyze the Hittites through the lens of your own subpersonality profile, a persona you've named, Kenny.
Yeah, and based on your notes, the Kenny archetype is defined by a really deep affinity for logic, structure, system maintenance, efficiency.
You describe Kenny as the architect of integrity.
Exactly. It's this part of the psyche that values fairness, sustainability, and the painstaking work of, designing order out of chaos.
It's the part of you that prefers a well-maintained engine over a flashy, erratic sports car.
Which is a great analogy. So our mission today isn't to just recite a timeline of ancient battles.
No, definitely not. We are unpacking how humanity very early on tried to solve the chaos problem.
How do you build systems that actually last?
Right. How do you balance the desire to expand your influence with the very real structural need to sustain what you've already built?
We're exploring how the Hittites engineered an operating system for human society, and how that mirrors the exact kind of internal architecture that your Kenny persona represents.
And the Hittites are the perfect historical mirror for this, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they weren't just a kingdom. They were obsessive system builders.
They figured out how to hold together a massive, incredibly diverse realm without letting it collapse under its own weight.
Right. And governing difference without erasing it is a massive cognitive leap. I mean, think about it. Modern global networks, multinational corporations, integrated societies.
They're still struggling with that exact same thing today.
We are. We're managing the same structural challenges the Hittites were managing over 3,000 years ago.
So to understand why a culture becomes so obsessed with systems and fortifications and treaties, we kind of have to look at the physical board they were playing on, right?
Yeah, the environment literally forced their hand.
Because if I look at the other major players of the Bronze Age, like Egypt or Mesopotamia, they're kind of playing the civilization-building game on easy mode.
Yeah, the alluvial basins.
Right. The Nile floods on a predictable schedule. It drops a layer of nutrient-rich black silt. You throw seeds in the ground, and the earth practically just hands you a massive agricultural surplus.
It does. Those environments allowed for massive centralized populations because the baseline of survival was guaranteed by the geography.
The rivers did the heavy lifting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But for the Hittites, centered in central Anatolia around their capital city of Hattusa.
Which is near modern Bozaskal in north-central Turkey, right?
Right. The geography offered no such favors. This is not a gentle river valley. We are talking about a rugged, unforgiving upland landscape. High, semi-arid plateaus, craggy hills, deep, fragmented river gorges.
So they basically spawned in on hard mode.
Very much on hard mode.
I mean, the winters in central Anatolia are brutal, heavy snow, and the summers are incredibly dry. You can't just wait for a river to magically flood your fields.
No, you can't. And that demands an entirely different psychological baseline.
How so?
Well, when your environment doesn't automatically provide for you, you cannot afford the luxury of disorganization. You are forced to become hyper-focused on storage.
Right.
You have to plan your harvest meticulously, build massive underground grain silos, and engineer water catchment systems just to survive the dry season and the winter freezes.
So the physical harshness required them to develop a mindset of careful management rather than wasteful luxury.
Yeah, exactly. You must build resilience into every level of your society.
I don't totally get that, though.
What do you mean?
Well, if I'm leading a tribe in a rugged, heavily defensible mountain range, and I know my environment is harsh but secure, the logical system move to me is to build a massive wall, pull up the ladder, and isolate.
Ah, I see.
Like, why expand at all? Why not just stay tucked away in the mountains and let the Egyptians and Babylonians fight over the flatlands?
Because of what was buried underneath those mountains.
Ah, the resources.
Anatolia was the metallurgical heartland of the ancient Near East. The Taurus Mountains and surrounding regions contained massive deposits of silver and crucial veins of copper, and eventually the earliest ironworking industries.
Wow.
In the Bronze Age, metals were the absolute foundation of the prestige economy and the military-industrial complex.
Because copper mixed with tin makes bronze.
Right. Without bronze, you have no weapons, no armor, no advanced tools. It was literally the oil of the ancient world.
And you can't just sit on the ancient world oil reserves and expect everyone to leave you alone.
Precisely the problem. The world was going to come looking for those metals. Furthermore, Anatolia is a land bridge.
Right, it connects the Aegean Sea in Europe to the Levant in Mesopotamia.
Exactly. If you look at the major trade arteries of the Bronze Age, they cut right through Hittite territory.
Being a bridge means you're constantly exposed to merchant caravans.
Yes, but also to migrating tribes and invading armies.
So isolation simply wasn't a mathematical option.
No.
Okay.
To survive, they had to control the corridors. They had to actively manage the borderlands and the alliances with the people living along those routes.
It's the ultimate test of the Kenny persona.
It really is.
You are in a harsh environment that requires obsessive internal maintenance, and you are sitting on the world's most valuable highway, which requires obsessive external management. You have to become the ultimate project manager of the ancient Near East.
And this brings us to the defining challenge of their civilization. Because they couldn't isolate, they were constantly expanding outward, absorbing different cultures, tribes, cities along these trade networks. But a blunt force, one-size-fits-all approach to governance shatters when applied to a highly diverse population spread across mountainous terrain.
Yeah, I mean, if you try to micromanage a town 1,000 miles away through mountain passes that are snowed in for 4 months of the year.
Your communication lines break down instantly.
So what do?
The Hittites recognized this geographical limitation, which led to their greatest structural innovation, a layered form of imperial administration.
Okay.
They did not attempt to rule every single conquered territory directly from Hattusa with uniform control. Instead, they utilized a highly sophisticated system of vassal kingdoms.
It's essentially a decentralized network with centralized protocols,
Yeah,
like an API for ancient governance.
that is a phenomenal way to frame it. The Hittite great king remained at the center. He was the supreme military commander, the chief judge, the high priest.
Right.
But in the outer territories, especially in regions like Syria or Western Anatolia, they left the local rulers in place. Yeah. They drafted highly specific treaties. As long as the local king, the vassal, remained loyal, paid an annual tribute, provided troops when the great king called for a campaign, and returned any political refugees.
You retain their local autonomy.
Exactly. They kept their own customs, their own local laws, their daily administrative structures.
The psychological maturity required to implement that is staggering.
It is.
To look at a newly conquered people and say, you don't have to be exactly like us to be integrated into our system. They were governing difference without demanding conformity.
It's the purest expression of the architect of integrity.
Yeah.
A brittle system demands absolute uniformity. A resilient system allows for flexibility at the edges while maintaining a rigid, inviolable core.
But to make this work, they must have needed something stronger than just the threat of violence. I mean, power couldn't just be about who had the biggest army, because armies are expensive.
And slow.
Right. So they tied political power to the concept of cosmic order. Your notes emphasize this point heavily. Breaking a treaty with the Hittites wasn't just political treason. It was a cosmic crime.
The treaties were sworn under oath before the gods, and not just the Hittite gods. The treaties explicitly invoked the local gods of the vassal state as witnesses.
Wow, so if a vassal rebelled, they weren't just defying the great king in Hattusa.
No, they were breaking a sacred oath witnessed by their own local deities. The political order and the cosmic order were essentially the same mechanism.
So the Hittite king ruled not merely as a warlord, but as the chief maintenance officer of cosmic justice.
Exactly.
I want to zoom in on what that concept of justice actually looked like on the ground for an ordinary person.
Yeah.
Because the Hittite legal code is where this Kenny mindset really takes center stage.
It's fascinating.
Because in neighboring regions, like Babylon, you have the Code of Hammurabi, which famously relies heavily on lex talionis, the law of retaliation.
Right. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth.
Yeah. If I cause you physical harm, the state inflicts that exact physical harm back on me.
The punitive model, which, is highly dramatic and emotionally satisfying on a visceral level.
Right.
But the Hittites looked at justice through an entirely different lens. Their legal code heavily de-emphasized physical mutilation and the death penalty. Instead, it was overwhelmingly focused on compensation and restitution.
So wait, if I steal your plow in the Hittite Empire, the state doesn't cut off my hand?
No. The state mandates that you owe the victim a specific amount of silver, or you must replace the plow and provide additional labor to make up for the lost time.
That's incredible.
If you assault someone and break their arm, you don't get your arm broken in return. You are legally required to pay for their medical care and provide a temporary worker to manage their fields until they heal.
This is a classic Kenny conflict resolution strategy.
How so?
It strips the ego and the emotion out of a grievance. It asks, what is the practical material cost to make this system whole again?
Exactly. Let's analyze the mechanics of why that is a superior system for an agrarian society in a harsh environment. Under an eye for an eye system. If a farmer breaks another farmer's arm and the state breaks the offender's arm in retaliation...
You now have two incapacitated farmers.
Right. The state has doubled the loss of productivity. In a rugged environment where survival depends on maximizing the harvest during a short growing season, maiming your own workforce is systemic suicide.
It's terrible risk management.
Exactly. The goal of the Hittite justice system was not to enforce terror or satisfy personal vengeance. It was to restore balance to the community.
System maintenance.
If you keep your workforce alive and functioning, even when they make mistakes, the society doesn't starve when winter comes.
I want to be careful here, though.
Okay.
Are we looking at a society that was highly progressive and egalitarian, or was this compensation-based system just cold, calculating utility?
Your sources are very clear to avoid romanticizing them, and we must do the same. This was not modern egalitarianism.
Right.
The Hittite Empire was a deeply stratified, hierarchical society. The royal family, the military elites, and the priesthood sat at the top, controlling massive estates. At the bottom were dependent workers, captives of war, and enslaved populations.
So the labor required to build those massive stone walls and harvest those fields was often forced.
Yes, or strictly commanded by the state.
So a system designed for stability does not necessarily mean a system designed for universal freedom.
Not at all. The Kenny archetype is focused on making sure the structure doesn't collapse. The achievement of the Hittites was building a bureaucratic architecture that could keep food, labor, raw materials, and information moving across a highly fractured landscape.
And a justice system focused on compensation rather than destruction is simply a more efficient, durable way to maintain that continuous flow.
It keeps the cogs turning.
But a massive system of laws, specific fines, layered vassal agreements stretching from the Aegean coast down to Syria, none of that works if the system forgets what it agreed to.
Right.
Going back to the tech analogy, an API is useless without a server to store the data.
And memory is the Achilles heel of any complex organization. If an empire relies solely on the personal charisma of its ruler or the fragile oral memory of a local council, it fragments the moment that ruler dies.
So a tribe becomes a permanent state when it develops an immortal memory.
Yes. It must store decisions beyond a single human lifespan.
Enter the scribes and the archives. When we think of Bronze Age technology, our minds immediately go to metallurgy, right? Bronze swords, the chariots.
Sure.
But your notes make a compelling argument that the Hittites' most powerful technology was their paperwork.
Administrative paperwork is the invisible infrastructure of civilization. At their capital, Hattusa, archaeologists discovered the Bozizkoy archive. UNESCO has actually recognized this site because it contains nearly 25,000 cuneiform tablets.
25,000. And these aren't just religious hymns.
They are the source code of the empire. You have commercial receipts, military supply logistics, royal decrees, records of oracle consultations, and, most importantly, the treaties.
And they were writing in multiple languages, weren't they?
They used their own native Hittite language for internal administration, but they also used Akkadian, which was the lingua franca, the international diplomatic language of the Bronze Age.
That requires an incredibly sophisticated educational apparatus.
Mm?
I mean, you need scribes who are bilingual or trilingual, capable of pressing complex cuneiform wedges into wet clay to negotiate international borders.
Scribes were basically the back-end programmers of the ancient world.
Your notes phrase the physical reality of this beautifully. It says, fortified walls, which are stone outside, protected the body of the state. Written records, which are clay inside, preserved its mind.
Clay inside, stone outside.
The physical medium of clay is so interesting, too, because paper burns and rots. But when an invading army sets fire to a Hittite archive room, the heat from the burning building actually bakes the clay tablets.
Turning them into stone and preserving the information for 3,000 years?
The destruction literally immortalizes the system.
It is the ultimate irony of the Bronze Age. And, the Hittites applied the same meticulous organizational genius to the most volatile aspect of ancient life: religion.
They were famously known as the land of 1,000 gods, right?
They were. This is where their talent for integration really shines. If you look at the Assyrians or later empires, conquest often meant enforcing your god upon the vanquished.
Like, my god beat your god, so now you worship mine.
Exactly. But the Hittites viewed that as an unnecessary friction point. Their religion was radically inclusive.
How inclusive are we talking?
When they conquered a neighboring state or absorbed a new territory, they did not suppress the local deities. They physically and theologically integrated them. They would bring the statues of the local gods to Hattusa and formally incorporate them into the Hittite pantheon.
That's a corporate merger strategy.
Yeah.
You acquire a smaller company, but you don't force them to change their logo or their office culture because you don't want the engineers to quit and protest.
It is highly utilitarian. By honoring the local storm god of a Syrian vassal city alongside the primary Hittite storm god of Hatti, they neutralized a massive source of potential rebellion.
That's brilliant.
In a multi-ethnic empire, recognizing local gods was a way of binding the peripheries to the center. If your local god has a temple in the capital, you feel represented. You are vested in the success of the system.
So it wasn't born out of modern, enlightened spiritual tolerance. It was a geopolitical tool to prevent civil war.
Absolutely. And we see this utilitarian mindset reflected in their cultural aesthetics as well.
Yeah.
The art of the Hittites is not the intimate, flowing, naturalistic art you might find in Minoan Crete or certain periods of Egypt. If you look at the rock sanctuary of Yazilikaya, just outside Hattusa, you see massive carvings of deities in strict formal processions.
It's not art trying to capture a fleeting moment of beauty. It's almost brutalist.
It values monumentality and formal display. You have rulers carved in rigid profile, massive stone lions and sphinxes guarding the gates of the capital.
Your notes refer to it as governance carved into rock.
Yes. The architecture is doing the geopolitical heavy lifting. When a vassal king from a smaller territory travels to Hattusa to renew his treaty, he has to walk through those massive, imposing stone gates.
The sheer mass of the architecture is designed to make the authority of the state feel eternal, immovable, inevitable.
It communicates visually what the treaties state legally. This system is too vast and too permanent to be broken.
The blueprint is just flawless. I mean, you have the rugged geography forcing them to be hypervigilant.
Yeah.
You have the layered vassal administration allowing them to scale.
Right.
You have the compensation-based laws maintaining internal harmony. You have the clay archives giving the empire an immortal memory. And you have this imposing structural culture integrating thousands of different gods. Is the ultimate Kenny architecture.
But an architecture is only theoretical until it is subjected to severe, sustained pressure.
And the late Bronze Age was a geopolitical pressure cooker. So what happens when this perfectly calibrated machine collides with the other great powers of the world?
This brings us to what historians refer to as the Amarna system, named after a cache of diplomatic letters found in Egypt. This was a highly integrated, sophisticated international network comprising the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Mitanni, and the Babylonians.
These weren't just isolated kingdoms taking potshots at each other. They were deeply interconnected.
Very deeply.
The notes mention that the kings would write letters to each other, using that Akkadian cuneiform we talked about, and they would refer to each other as brother.
They operated as a peer-to-peer network. They exchanged lavish diplomatic gifts. We have letters of kings complaining to the pharaoh, essentially saying, My brother, send me more gold, for in your land gold is as common as dust.
That's amazing.
They arranged royal marriages, sending daughters across the ancient world to serve as literal political glue. It was a constant, high-stakes chess match for control of lucrative trade routes, particularly the cities of the Levant and Syria, which were the commercial hubs of the era.
Your notes use this geopolitical landscape to do a fantastic job deconstructing how we usually view ancient history. We tend to look for heroes and villains,
Right.
but through the Kenny lens, these kings are just system actors. They are administrators trying to manage an architecture under immense stress, forced to choose between collapse and stability.
Let's examine a few of the key architects and some of the wrecking balls to see how this played out. We start with Mursili first, around 1620 BCE.
Marsilia pulls off an absolute geopolitical shocker. He marches his army over 1,000 kilometers down the Euphrates River to sack the great city of Babylon.
From a traditional historical perspective, this makes him a legend. He toppled the legacy of Hammurabi. It's a breathtaking military feat.
Yet the logistics of moving a Bronze Age army that distance, maintaining supply lines, executing a siege on one of the greatest cities in the world, it proves the Hittites possessed terrifying long-distance power projection. But if we analyze it systemically,
He sacked the city, took the loot, and then marched all the way home. He didn't establish a permanent garrison. He didn't integrate Babylon into the vassal system.
and worse, the sheer exhaustion and cost of that campaign destabilized the core of the empire.
Exactly. Almost immediately upon returning to Hattusa, Mursili, I was assassinated in a palace coup. The empire plunged into decades of internal chaos.
So Mursili emulates a failure of sustainability. He executed a bold, highly visible action, but he lacked the back-end system to maintain the game. His military success actually broke the operating system at home.
It's the equivalent of a tech company putting 100% of their resources into a massive product launch, getting huge press coverage, but completely ignoring the server capacity.
The moment the traffic hits, the entire site crashes and the CEO is ousted. Execution without infrastructure is a liability.
Which necessitates the rise of our next key figure, Telopiner, around 1525 BCE. If Mursili I was the erratic visionary, Telopinu is the quintessential Kenny-coded administrator.
He didn't march on Babylon.
He didn't expand the borders at all. His focus was entirely inward. He looked at the chaos caused by the constant assassinations and blood feuds among the nobility, and he recognized that the system was cannibalizing itself.
So to fix it, he issued the Telopinu Edict.
He literally wrote down a new standard operating procedure for the monarchy. He established strict, unalterable rules for royal succession. He documented exactly who was in line for the throne to remove the ambiguity that led to civil war.
And he also stripped the king of the right to execute nobles arbitrarily, right?
Yes. Mandating that capital cases be tried before a council called the Panku, he was instituting checks and balances.
He looked at the blood feud and said, this is an inefficient way to run a government. He repaired the machine. We don't remember him for conquering the world, but he ensured there was still a world left to conquer.
He stabilized the ship, which eventually allowed later kings to push outward again. This leads us to Sipilulima, Nursti, operating in the mid-14th century BCE. Your knights designate him as the peak builder.
Sipilulima I seems to have achieved what Mursili I couldn't. He expanded the empire massively, but he actually held on to the territory.
He dismantled the rival Mitanni Empire in Syria and brought vast swaths of wealthy territory under the Hittite vassal system. He was a master of both military strategy and diplomacy. We even have records of an Egyptian queen, likely the widow of King Tutankhamun, writing to Sipilulima, begging him to send one of his sons to marry her and become pharaoh of Egypt because she had no heir.
That is wild. The pharaoh's widow asking a Hittite prince to take over Egypt. It shows the absolute peak of their geopolitical leverage. But the notes highlight a massive tragic vulnerability in his expansion.
Every complex system has unintended ripple effects. During his campaigns in the Levant, his army captured Egyptian prisoners of war and brought them back to the Hittite heartland. It is highly likely those prisoners carried a devastating pathogen.
A biological shock the system was totally blind to.
A plague erupted in Anatolia and ravaged the population for 20 years. It killed Sipilulima himself, and then it killed his immediate successor.
Wow.
The Hittites had built walls against armies and archives to preserve memory, but their massive interconnected network served as a superhighway for a virus that decimated their workforce.
It perfectly illustrates how your greatest systemic success, in this case massive territorial expansion and taking prisoners, can introduce the exact mechanism of your own destabilization.
The empire survived the plague, but it fundamentally altered their manpower and resources, setting the stage for the most famous military encounter of the Bronze Age, the Battle of Kadesh, under the rule of King Mu'tali II.
Around 1274 BCE, the Hittites under Mu'tali II clashed with the Egyptians under Ramesses II. This is the heavyweight title fight of antiquity.
It is considered one of the largest chariot battles in human history. To understand the mechanics of this, you have to look at the technology. The Egyptians utilized lightweight, two-man chariots designed for speed and mobile archery.
And the Hittites had innovated.
They moved the axle forward on their chariots to support the weight of 3 men: a driver, a shield bearer, and a warrior wielding a thrusting spear. It was a heavy shock platform designed to smash through infantry lines.
The logistics of just getting to Kadesh are mind-boggling. You're moving tens of thousands of infantry and thousands of horses down through the mountains and along the Orontes River in Syria. Feeding those animals alone is a monumental systemic feat.
And at Kadesh, Mu'tali II executed a brilliant tactical deception. He used fake spies to feed Ramesses false intelligence, convincing the pharaoh that the Hittite army was far away.
So Ramesses rushed his divisions forward.
Stringing them out, yes. And the Hittite heavy chariotry ambushed the Egyptian camp, nearly killing the pharaoh.
But strategically, despite the brilliant ambush, it ends in a stalemate.
Neither side could achieve total victory. The Hittites couldn't capture the Egyptian fortress, and the Egyptians had taken too many casualties to continue the campaign.
The Kenny insight from your notes here is exceptionally sharp. Mu'tali II won the tactical moment, but Kadesh exposed the absolute limit of blunt force expansion.
When two incredibly complex, highly organized, evenly matched systems collide, warfare stops solving the problem. It just becomes an endless, unsustainable drain on the treasuries and manpower of both empires.
You can't fight a forever war when you are relying on fragile agricultural surpluses back home, which makes the actions of the next ruler the defining triumph of the Hittite operating system.
Hattusili III. He actually usurped the throne from his nephew, so again, we are not looking at a moral paragon. But his systemic vision was unparalleled. He looked at the geopolitical board, he saw the ongoing stalemate with Egypt in the south, and he saw the rising aggressive power of the Assyrians to the east.
He realized that a two-front war would break the Hittite machine.
So instead of fighting, he changes the paradigm of global politics. He initiates contact with Ramesses II, and in 1258 BCE, they ratify the Eternal Peace Treaty.
And this isn't just a basic ceasefire. It isn't just, we will stop shooting at each other.
It is a comprehensive, legally binding international architecture. It contained mutual defense clauses. If a third party attacks Egypt, the Hittites will send troops to defend the pharaoh, and vice versa. It contained non-aggression pacts. It established borders.
And it had extradition clauses.
Yeah.
If a political dissident flees Hattusa and tries to seek asylum in Egypt, Ramesses is legally obligated to arrest him and send him back safely. We are talking about Interpol-level international law operating in the Bronze Age.
It is the apex of the architect of integrity. Hattusili III chose long-term archive stability over the ego-driven pursuit of total victory. He recognized that the only way to secure the empire against the unpredictable chaos of the future was to bind his greatest enemy in a web of mutual legal obligations.
A replica of this treaty, written in Akkadian cuneiform, actually hangs in the United Nations headquarters in New York today. It is the bedrock concept of modern diplomacy.
It really is.
Let's step back and look at the magnificent machine they have built. They have mastered their brutal geography. They have a scalable, layered, vassal administration. They have a legal code focused on maintaining the workforce rather than destroying it. They have immortal clay archives. They have an inclusive, integrated religion. And now they have a mutual defense pact with the other superpower of the world.
The architecture seems completely bulletproof.
It was an extraordinary achievement in risk management. So, how on earth does it all completely collapse just a few decades later? By 1200 BCE, Hattusa is burned to the ground and the empire is gone.
This forces us to confront the shadow side of the Kenny subpersonality, the inherent vulnerability of structure. The fall of the Hittites was part of a much larger catastrophe known as the Late Bronze Age collapse.
Right.
Within a span of roughly 50 years, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans in Greece, the empires in the Levant, and the Kassites in Babylon all fell. Only Egypt survived, and just barely in a severely weakened state.
We tend to look for a single cause. We want a narrative. We want to say the volcano erupted or the barbarians invaded.
But systems don't work that way. The collapse of the Bronze Age was a cascading systems failure. Let's use an infrastructure analogy. Think of the modern electrical power grid.
Okay.
It is incredibly efficient. It routes power precisely where it is needed, balancing loads across thousands of miles. But that efficiency relies on extreme interconnectivity. If one major regional transformer blows out, the system tries to reroute the power, overloading the next transformer. Suddenly, a single failure cascades and half a continent goes dark.
The interconnectivity that made the system so efficient became the exact mechanism of its rapid disruption.
Exactly.
So the Hittite system was perfectly calibrated for the pressures it knew. But what were the transformers that started blowing out?
Your notes detail a perfect storm of compounding pressures. First, the economic backbone began to fracture. The entire Bronze Age military and economic complex was dependent on international trade. You need copper from Cyprus or Anatolia, and you need tin.
But tin is incredibly rare.
The major tin routes stretched all the way from Afghanistan, across Mesopotamia, and into the Mediterranean. If any part of that massive supply chain is disrupted, you can no longer forge bronze.
And without bronze, your agricultural tools degrade and your military loses its edge.
At the exact time these supply chains began to experience friction, the region suffered a severe, prolonged climatic shift. Pollen data and isotopic records show a massive, multi-decade drought sweeping across the eastern Mediterranean.
And when you have a highly structured society that depends on taxing agricultural surplus, a multi-year drought isn't just a food crisis, it's a fatal systemic crisis. The compensation laws, the treaties, the archives, none of that matters if the granaries are empty.
Exactly. The complex administrative overhead of the Hittite Empire, the standing armies, the scribal schools, the royal courts, became an unsustainable burden when the caloric input crashed. This internal starvation and economic stagnation triggered the next domino: mass migration.
The famous Sea Peoples.
Yes. The historical records of Egypt and Ugarit describe confederations of raiders and migrants coming from the sea and the collapsing lands to the west. But we shouldn't view them just as organized, malevolent pirate fleets. Many of them were likely climate refugees.
Right.
When the systems in the Aegean and the Western Mediterranean failed due to drought and famine, entire populations picked up and moved looking for food and stability.
But they crashed into a Hittite system that was already starving and economically stalled.
The Hittites had built an empire optimized for managing localized, predictable threats through diplomacy and chariot warfare. They had no systemic mechanism to handle a total, simultaneous failure of international trade, unprecedented drought, and waves of decentralized, desperate migrations.
The structure became brittle.
When a canny system relies entirely on the rules, it loses the elasticity required to survive when the rest of the world stops playing by those rules. The center simply could not hold, and the empire fragmented back into local chiefdoms.
The terrifying part of the notes is what comes next. Because when the intricate negotiated architecture of the Hittite diplomacy failed, humanity didn't just build a better version of it. The power vacuum in the Near East was eventually filled by the Neo-Assyrian Empire.
And the Assyrians learned a very different lesson from the Bronze Age collapse. If the Hittites were system managers, the Assyrians were system enforcers.
They weren't writing compensation laws or politely integrating local guides.
They utilized deliberate, calculated terror, mass deportations, flaying rebels alive. They maintained order not through layered vassal treaties, but through the blunt force trauma of the world's first true professional standing army.
The transition from the Hittites to the Assyrians shows exactly what happens when the delicate architecture of diplomacy and negotiated hierarchy breaks down. Nuance is replaced by brutality.
It's so boring.
This has been an absolutely staggering journey. To the listener who provided these notes, mapping your internal psychological architecture against a 3,000-year-old empire has been incredibly illuminating.
It reveals a fundamental truth about human history. We are obsessed with the dramatic conquerors, the men who burn things down. But history actually preserves what structures can hold. The Hittites taught humanity that civilization survives when someone takes the time to enforce the standards,
To write the treaties.
to transition justice from blood feuds to compensation. They proved that an immortal memory clay inside, stone outside, is more powerful than a temporary army.
Their legacy isn't just the ruins of Hattusa. Their legacy is the very concept that a promise can be binding across international borders.
They engineered the concept of sustainable statecraft.
Which leaves us with a final, slightly haunting thought to process. We've spent the hour exploring how the Hittites were the ultimate Kenny system, brilliant at engineering order, but ultimately brittle when faced with a chaotic, shifting world. They collapsed because their highly optimized system lacked the elasticity to handle multiple simultaneous global crises: climate change, supply chain failures, and mass migrations.
Sounds familiar.
We look at our modern world today. We have built the most interconnected, deeply structured, complex global system in the history of the planet. We rely on hyper-efficient, just-in-time supply chains. We rely on international agreements and stable climate patterns to feed billions. We are the ultimate system builders.
We really are.
So the question is, are we building a modern architecture that is genuinely resilient, capable of flexing and adapting to the compounding shocks we know are coming? Or have we just engineered a much larger, much more complicated version of a brittle Bronze Age machine, waiting for our own transformers to blow?